legal systems really everywhere around the world are focused on regulating, legalizing, or authorizing, licensing the use of nature. That is to say, it wasn't focused on attempting to strike a balance of human need and nature's need. It was instead really focused on, as I learned, just extracting and taking as much as we could from nature as fast as possible. And our laws, our environmental laws, legalize that. I realized that systemic change that was needed, not only changing our own attitudes toward nature, but changing how nature itself is treated under legal systems. From being this object, essentially the property of humans to use as we wish, but rather as a subject of rights, that is, as ecosystems and species, as biodiversity, as being, having intrinsic value.
What if the very laws designed to protect our environment are in many ways actually set up to permit its degradation? It's a provocative question and one that leads us to a revolutionary shift in legal thinking. Welcome to Is Climate Change Your Concern podcast. In today's episode, we are diving deep into the powerful and growing global movement for the rights of nature. We'll explore why conventional environmental regulations often fall short merely managing harm rather than preventing it, the transformative concept of recognizing rivers, forests, and entire ecosystems as legal entities with inherent rights, how this movement is unfolding worldwide with groundbreaking examples, and crucially, what the rights of nature can mean for tackling the climate crisis and forging a truly sustainable future. Our esteemed guest is Margil, who is a global pioneer of the rights of nature movement and executive director at the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. She played a pivotal role in drafting Ecuador's constitutional provisions recognizing nature's rights, a world's first. Mari also served as the primary drafter of a Himalayas Bill of Rights in Nepal, along with her extensive work with governments, tribal nations, and indigenous communities across the globe. Thank you so much, Mari, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Mary, can we begin this conversation by first understanding about your journey into environmental law and advocacy? And maybe you would also like to highlight what drew you to rights of nature?
Well, I've done different kinds of environmental work, and it always felt like we were trying to just stop bad things from happening, which is what a lot of environmental work is everywhere around the world. It's so often focused on trying to stop an industrial hog farm or clear cutting of a forest or some other kind of, industrial activity, pollution, drilling, mining, and so on. Governments around the world have adopted laws that legalize activities, particularly industrial activities, which cause great harm to the natural world, to our air, to our soils, to our water, to species. Sort of as I was, sort of being an environmental activist, it was deeply unsatisfying that everything you were doing felt like you were trying to just stop something bad as opposed to try to do something good for nature. And over time, I came to really understand how the legal system worked, which is to say that legal systems really everywhere around the world are focused on regulating, legalizing, or authorizing, licensing the use of nature to support human development. And that authorization for the use of nature was rather indiscriminate. That is to say, it wasn't focused on attempting to strike a balance of human need and nature's need, so that we would live in our harmonious, truly sustainable way on the planet. It was instead really focused on, as I learned, just extracting and taking as much as we could from nature as fast as possible. and our laws, our environmental laws, legalize that. Once I really came to understand how that legal system worked, prioritizing harm to nature over its protection, I realized that it was really systemic change that was needed. That is to say, changing how human beings understand not only their relationship with the natural world, that we're part of the natural world, but that we depend on it, and that by treating it truly as a natural resource, just sort of sitting around waiting for humans to use it, we were harming our own habitat that we depend upon, the natural world, which we depend upon. And so the systemic change that I came to understand that was needed, still needed, was not only changing our own attitudes toward nature, but changing how nature itself is treated under legal systems. From being this object, essentially the property of humans to use as we wish, but rather as a subject of rights, that is, as ecosystems and species, as biodiversity, as being, having intrinsic value, and legal rights that humans must guarantee and protect, so even the most basic right of all, the right to exist. And so that's really where the rights of nature work for me began, was coming to understand the need for a really systemic change in how we treat nature under the law, and changing our laws to reflect that, which of course is a lot easier said than done. But we've made a lot of progress over the last 15 plus years, bringing this movement into the world and seeing it spread to countries really around the globe.
Mari, now you've been involved with the movement for decades, and literally, like your organization, I learned that was also involved in drafting the first constitutional provisions that were inserted in Ecuador for rights of nature. And you've seen this movement really take off. I mean, we can debate whether it's taken off, whether it's reached a critical mass or not, but still there's a wider acceptance and knowledge about the movement. Would you want to take some time and reflect on your journey with respect to mainstreaming this ecocentric approach? Maybe if you would want to highlight some of the challenges, some milestones. Yeah.
Of course. So the co-founder of my organization, the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, Thomas Lindsay, he wrote the very first rights of nature law anywhere in the world. And that was in 2006 for a small community in the state of Pennsylvania in the eastern United States. The community was facing the dumping of toxic materials in the community, and they looked to environmental laws to protect them from this, but found that the environmental laws were in fact legalizing the very activity they understood that they needed to stop to protect themselves, to protect their water, to protect the public health. So when Thomas worked with the community to change the status of nature and to recognize it possesses legal rights, that first rights of nature law took the theory of this idea of could nature possess legal rights and put it into actual binding law, made it tangible, made it practical. And that began to spread among different communities in the United States. And 2 years later, in 2008, Ecuador was in the process of drafting a new constitution, and some people involved in that process learned of the work that we were doing, and invited us to Ecuador to meet with delegates to their constituent assembly, the elected body that was drafting Ecuador's new constitution. And we shared what the rights of nature is, and through a consultative process, assisted them to draft constitutional provisions. And later that year, the people of Ecuador voted on the new constitution, and part of that, for the very first time, enshrined that nature, or what they call Pachamama, possesses constitutional rights, the highest form of right that we have within human written law. That really birthed the movement. So we went from small communities adopting this in the United States to a country putting this into their highest level of legal protection, the Constitution. And from there, it birthed what I would call the rights of nature movement. And so, it really began to spread. And as you say, I don't think it's reached a critical mass as much as I would like it to. It has not moved fast enough for me, but it has moved quite fast. So you have a number of countries now have national rights of nature laws and court decisions recognizing nature possesses certain legal rights, or certain parts of nature possess legal rights. So in Bangladesh, all rivers have had their rights recognized, upheld by the Supreme Court. In Uganda, the National Environmental Act there was amended to recognize the rights of nature. In Colombia, you've had a number of court decisions recognizing rights of the Atrato River and other ecosystems. In Panama, you've had several national rights of nature laws adopted. Bolivia adopted a rights of Mother Earth law. So you've had a number of countries take this step. In Spain, there's been national law adopted recognizing the rights of the Mar Menor Lagoon. And you've had other steps forward. Local communities have adopted rights of nature laws in places like Mexico, United States, Brazil, and First Nations and tribal nations, both in Canada and the United States, who've really become leaders in the rights of nature movement, have adopted the rights of nature into their indigenous legal frameworks. And so we've seen a lot of expansion of this movement, and we often talk about this movement as not just being a legal movement, but as with all movements for legal rights, there has to be a cultural, societal shift as well. And we're beginning to see that with the rights of nature, that people are speaking more about the need to recognize our place within the natural world, to change our relationship with the natural world, and embody that and enforce that within law. And so the rights of nature is becoming a bit more part of that discussion. We, of course, want to see it happen more and more, particularly as environmental crises accelerate with climate change and species extinction and so on. But we've seen a lot of movement, and that is moving in very much the right direction.
Murray, how potent would you consider this legal tool when it comes to dealing with climate crisis?
I think it's critical. We tend to think of the climate as out there and not sort of here on Earth. But truly, we humans, need a healthy, stable climate. The climate is, very fragile, and human activity has deeply impacted it. But what we know is that climate change is driving huge shifts on planet Earth, meaning for species it's accelerating extinction rates, it's causing different species, animal and plant, to have to adapt to a shifting climate, more water, more rain, less rain, drought, etc., fires, higher temperatures. So we're seeing migratory animals moving in places they haven't been before, for example. Warmer ocean waters is causing all sorts of problems for marine species and so on. I mean, there's so many impacts on species, as well as, of course, human species, from everything from fires to drought to water crises and so on. Climate is having huge impacts on how humans live on this earth. And so our own health and well-being, we humans, as well as the health and well-being of the natural world, is dependent on us curbing climate change, reversing this trend of rising temperatures and more emissions. And the rights of nature is right in the middle of that. It's recognizing that the climate itself, which again we tend to think of as out there, but is really part of our day-to-day, the atmospheric conditions, and our impacts, our own activities every day impacting the climate. So a right to a healthy climate for us and for nature, separate from us, and a right of the climate itself to be healthy is really critical. We've done some work on this in places like Nepal, where the Himalayas are often referred to as the third pole. You have the North Pole, the South Pole, and then the Himalayas are often thought of as the third pole on planet Earth. And you have the tallest mountain there, Mount Everest, and so on. And climate change is having a really significant impact. It's the fastest warming mountain range on Earth, the Himalaya. And you've had, like the the Nepali government, for example, holding like cabinet meetings at base camp at Mount Everest, for example, to demonstrate, to show to the world how impactful climate change has been, particularly on a nation that is a fraction of the climate change impacts on Earth. I mean, they're just such a small fraction, Nepal, on what's going on with the climate. So they're being severely impacted and have very small, are very not very responsible for what's happening. And so we've worked with and met with, for example, government officials, parliamentarians, on what would it look like to recognize the right to a healthy climate for the Himalayan mountain ecosystem, as well as the species that live there, as well as for the climate itself, in order for the country to be able to hold to account those polluters, nations, corporations that are most impacting the climate within Nepal. So a way to recognize rights, that we need a right to a healthy climate. And nature needs a right to a healthy climate, and being able to protect that and protect the climate itself. So we're seeing this more and more being moved into rights of nature law and discussion and policy.
Mari, I would imagine that rights of nature is not an end in itself. It's, of course, a tool to reach at a particular place, which is a healthy ecosystem. Would you say, as you now have seen laws in action as well, would you say that the outcome of implementing these tools has been successful? What I'm trying to understand is that when once rights of nature are adopted, how do the outcomes look like? How different are they?
So I would like to talk about Ecuador here, because Ecuador has had it in its national constitutional framework. Well, it's the only country to have it in its national constitutional framework, number one, but it's also the only country to have it in national law for the longest, since 2008. So they have had, in Ecuador, many cases brought into court to seeking to enforce the rights of nature, which is exactly what you want to have happen, right? So whenever we have a legal right, we being human beings, that right only is meaningful if we have the ability to activate it. That is to say, if something is infringing on my right, like in the United States, for example, I have a right to free speech under our First Amendment of our Constitution. That doesn't mean anything if I can't actually enforce it, if the government is doing something that interferes with my right to free speech. So the way to do that is you have to go into court to enforce that right. And I can do that. And that means that it's a meaningful substantive right. So within Ecuador, what has happened over the last 15 plus years is you've seen cases go into court in which nature itself is the plaintiff. And you have a human being or a community, for instance, or an NGO that is going to court, but they're going to court on behalf of and in the name of nature itself, because nature is the holder of the legal right. So it's their right, its right, that's at stake. And what we have seen is many, many cases being decided by courts within Ecuador at lower levels, but also at the highest level, the constitutional court level, not only affirming that nature possesses constitutional rights, rights to exist, rights to evolve, right to be restored, among other rights, but that those rights are substantive. They require something to happen in order to guarantee and uphold them. So very recently, at the end of 2024, the highest court, the Constitutional Court, ruled in a case that marine ecosystems within Ecuadorian waters possess constitutional rights. So that means that what the court said is that they possess these constitutional rights under Chapter 7 of Ecuador's Constitution. And not only do they possess those rights, but the government has to take steps to ensure that those rights are upheld and that the marine ecosystems have the ability to persevere, to be robust, to be healthy, to be restored. And so that it directed Ecuador's government, which hasn't been terrific on upholding the rights of nature within its own activities, that it has to take certain steps to uphold these rights. So making meaningful changes in government decision-making and authorizing of, for example, industrial activities, that the government has to take those steps to guarantee those rights. So that's one example. I mean, marine ecosystems are deeply being impacted by climate change, rising ocean temperatures, by illegal fishing, other things. So that's one case, a very milestone kind of case. There have been others. You might be familiar, I think it was 2021, if I'm not mistaken, that the Constitutional Court in Ecuador also ruled on the Los Cedros case, which was a case about the Los Cedros protected forest, where the national government had authorized exploratory mining within that forest, which includes a cloud forest ecosystem. And a community brought a case to say, we think this violates the rights of nature to do this in a fragile ecosystem, habitat for at-risk species, and the Constitutional Court agreed, saying that by conducting mining or exploratory mining within this fragile place would violate the rights of nature. And ruled that, instructed that that exploratory mining had to end, the equipment had to be taken out, and that the mining permits or licenses that the government had authorized were revoked. That's huge. Those are milestone kinds of decisions, particularly in a country like Ecuador, where mining is an important part of the economy. And so I think what you're starting to see is these big decisions being ruled on in Ecuador, having very impactful decisions to protect the environment. But Ecuador also has been, from the very beginning, importantly, kind of the guide star, if you will. It was able to do something no other country had ever done, recognize the rights of nature within a constitutional framework. Other countries have followed suit. People follow what Ecuador is doing. It hasn't been easy, and it hasn't been, a straight line, perfect. We would never expect it to be that. But it has been a guiding light in this movement as to what's possible. What's possible in terms of our relationship with nature? What's possible in terms of changing how not only governments but we make decisions that impact nature? And what do we need to do to really protect nature, which is very different than what we largely are doing on this planet today.
Mary, and also, have you observed any symbiotic relationship when it comes to legal change and the change that we see in the society? What I'm asking for is, what I'm trying to inquire is that, like, going to courts and protecting it is one thing, but have we also been able to successfully, as you're calling it, a systemic change movement? Have you also seen trends towards that, and what are your observations there?
Yeah, I mean, the lawmaking is not just about going to court. That's just how you enforce these rights if they're being violated or will be violated in some way. What you hope will happen is that you don't have to go to court. What I mean by that is that once a community or a state or a province or a national government has a rights of nature law in place, that they will implement that law, which means changing the kind of decisions that are making in order to guarantee those rights, which could be any number of things that they must do. It could be changing the kinds of industrial activities that they permit, changing the kind of restoration activities that might occur within a marine ecosystem or otherwise, changing the kinds of activities that are allowed in a certain place or around a certain species. There's any number of things that can be done to uphold the rights of a species or an ecosystem. Places like Panama, which has a marine sea turtle rights of nature law, which they use to supplement their just national broad rights of nature law, so they focus down on marine turtle species. And there's very specific actions that need to occur to protect the rights of sea turtles there, including things like protecting where they lay their eggs, essentially calling off limits to certain human activities within those breeding grounds, where they raise their young, where, marine habitat that we know is critical to their existence and resilience and building back their populations. So they've done it in a way that, is, I think, really quite ideal. You pass a law to protect something, you implement those protections. That's the way it should go. And, who knows ultimately what will happen, but that's what you hope to see happen. And in other places, for example, like in Australia, the Blue Mountain Council adopted a resolution around rights of nature, and that launched a process there to say, well, what does this mean for us? A municipal government does all sorts of things. It does things like, handle road construction, or what do we do with our waste? It has all, public lands. What do we do? How do we treat the grass, or whatever it might be? That might seem very small, but the idea is they're starting to talk about what do we do to change our activities here to make it compatible with upholding the rights of nature. And what we have seen, I think it's very easy to dismiss, like, oh, that's just a small place doing small things. No. The only reason Ecuador moved, was able to move in this direction of rights of nature is it happened elsewhere. And that's really important for, I think, us to understand when we're thinking about systemic change, is it doesn't matter where it starts. If it can help inspire and educate and share the experience of places large or small, it can help other places to begin to follow suit. And build from there. And I think that's really important for any of us who think of ourselves as activists. You make the change where you can and grow it from there.
Mary, now transitioning to a point that you mentioned in our pre-recording call, wherein you said that rights of nature movement is often also utilized by people who are also trying to assert their democratic authority. I'm curious, how do you see the relationship between democratic values and environmental protection?
I think they're deeply connected. They're integral to one another. I think it's maybe easiest to see this where it comes into very, stark relief is in places like local communities. Everywhere we've worked around the world, local communities, like a town or a township or a village or a county even, we find, people in those communities find, that they lack the democratic decision-making authority to protect the places where they live. So whether it's from activities like fracking or mining or dumping of pollution into a river, for instance, the authority that communities have to stop those kinds of environmentally harmful practices is extremely limited to zero. That power to make decisions about whether that activity happens or not is usually held at a state or provincial level or a national government level. Communities see that they don't have that power. So when we say that democratic rights and the rights of nature are intricately related, it's because what we have found is that you can't protect the environment if you don't have the authority to protect the environment. And so people and communities have essentially been taking that authority for themselves and passing rights of nature laws, saying, we're going to establish a higher level of protection for nature, including recognizing its rights, higher than what our state or province has done, or higher than what our national government has done. And it's very much a democratic movement to protect where you live. And that's become really critical. The other place where we see it so clearly is with First Nations and tribal nations. So within the United States, for example, this is where I live, we do a lot of work with tribal nations that are, they have what we call a special relationship with our federal government here in the United States, which is supposed to be government to government, but it's not quite that. And tribes are constantly fighting for their tribal sovereignty, their ability to make the key decisions they need to make to protect their people, to protect their lands. Rights of nature is squarely inside of that. The authority of tribes to recognize the rights of nature and enforce those rights. The conversations we've had with tribal members from different tribes has been that this is very much about exerting their tribal sovereignty, strengthening their rights as a tribe to be self-governing. And so we're seeing that become more and more a part of the equation about environmental protection and democratic protection being integrally related.
It's fascinating because one would imagine that in today's time, at least democratic values would be something that would have trickled down. But once you put it this way, it's more profound to realize that the challenges there as well are systemic.
Yeah, and I guess I would add one other thing, which is, when we first started working on the rights of nature, we often contrast it with existing conventional environmental laws. And those laws largely legalize harm to nature, so that's obviously a clear contrast between rights of nature laws and conventional environmental laws. But another key piece of it that we found to be a real failure of conventional environmental laws is they make it extremely difficult for people, you and me, to be able to uphold these laws, to enforce these laws. Meaning it's very, very difficult for just a citizen or an NGO or a community to look at it, even a conventional environmental law that's authorizing fracking or mining or something, and try to enforce even the limited protections within them. It's really difficult as a citizen to go into court, for example, to enforce the protections. What rights of nature laws, what we've done from the very beginning in building these laws, is not only recognize that nature possesses legal rights, but that human beings, residents within a town, for example, or in Ecuador, everybody who lives in Ecuador, has the authority to enforce those rights on behalf of and in the name of nature. So this human beings being able to enforce these rights and having that automatic authority to do it is such a stark contrast to conventional environmental law, and what we thought needed very much to be different than conventional environmental law, because it's so often, we see that as poor as existing environmental laws often are, even as poor as they are, the governments very often fail to even enforce those laws, those protections, however limited they might be. People are left out of that equation too often. And so with the rights of nature, we wanted to make sure that, particularly when governments fail to enforce or uphold their own laws, in this case a rights of nature law, that people, communities, indigenous peoples, for example, can step into that shoes of the river or the forest or the species to uphold those rights, to enforce those rights in courts if necessary. That becomes so critical and has been key to the successful enforcement of the rights of nature, particularly in Ecuador. Empowering people to do this, particularly when the government fails to do it itself.
And now, Mari, as we inch closer towards critical tipping points, how do you see rights of nature movement proceed? Would you want to highlight some of the exciting areas that you're looking at, or some of the specific things that holds promise, especially as we are inching closer towards the situation?
Inching closer to
Critical
ecological
tipping points.
collapse. Yeah.
Critical tipping points, it's a better way to put it, and when it comes to we don't know what it would look like, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the situation with the natural environment here on planet Earth isn't great. So I guess I'd say a few things. One is the rights of nature provides a framework to change our relationship, which absolutely needs to happen. Change our relationship with the natural world. We need to do it, we need to do it 50 years ago, 1,000 years ago, but here we are. And so it provides that framework. And it's not a voluntary framework, it's not just about me recycling more, for instance. It's about mandating this change, and which means mandating how we live on the planet. We think that's essential for addressing the crises, multiple crises that we face today. So the rights of nature sit squarely in the middle of the kind of change that we need. And countries are doing it, communities are doing it, and we need to see it accelerate and grow far faster than it has thus far. But we've already got a running start, which is really important. And I think the other thing which I would mention, which we haven't talked about here, is, obviously we're talking about what's happening here on Earth, human impact on Earth. I've been working with a small working group over the past few years about looking off Earth as well. Within the United States, with different space companies in different parts of the world, there's an increasing focus on human colonization of Moon and ultimately Mars. So exporting human development off Earth. And so we developed a Declaration of the Rights of the Moon to highlight how we must not export the kind of human environmental damage that we are so familiar with here on Earth. We must not export that off Earth. We must consider our impact on the pristine Moon ecosystem, the pristine Mars ecosystem, before we start the kind of extractive and development activities that are being envisioned off Earth. And so we've done different things, including drafting this declaration and sharing it and so on. But it's a way for us, I think, to stop, don't export what we have already done here on Earth, off Earth, but also to reflect us back to what's going on here on Earth. Let's stop doing what we've been doing. We know we need to. We've got a framework to do that. So let's get on with it. So that's really part of what we're seeing in the next years ahead.
And would there be a call to action for different stakeholders?
Absolutely. We've, for example, when the United States NASA, the science agency and space agency here in the United States, we've submitted comments for them, for example, on their proposed Artemis program from Moon to Mars, about needing to focus on your environmental impact before you start doing these things. We already know. This might sound surprising, as amazing as the Apollo missions were in the 1960s, and having humans actually reach the moon and walk on the moon. Scientific achievements extraordinary, but that caused significant impact on the moon's fragile ecosystem, and we don't talk about that. Nobody wants to talk about that, but it's happened, and that will only increase if we do these things that we're saying we're going to do. And very little, if any, discussion or focus has been on the environmental impact off Earth. I think that's a huge mistake, and it's something that we can learn from even here on Earth about our own actions here on Earth. And so I hope it becomes sort of a synergy between thinking about where we're going into these pristine ecosystems that have never been reached before, and what we're doing here on the planet.
Yeah, it's crazy how we do things and then think that what harm did we do, rather than anticipating what might our actions entail. Mary, thank you so much for your time. I think, and you've been doing some great work, your organization has been doing some great work when it comes to mainstreaming this approach. I got to know of this movement, especially once I read an article somewhere which was published by you, and ever since I've been working on this topic in some way or the other, and I'm very grateful to you for that. And I hope this movement gains traction, and in India especially, lots of judges have been trying to adopt it. This has sparked discussion, but unfortunately, of course, we've not been able to mainstream it. But hopefully, there's some progress there as well. So,
Yes, definitely.
thank you so much for your time, and I'm grateful to you for doing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for bringing attention to this.